Shabbat Shalom, good morning everybody. And once again, Mazal Tov to everybody. It's wonderful to celebrate at such a wonderful time in a person's life, a liminal moment. I'll be honest with you, I wrote this sermon over the course of this past week, and as many times as I tried to instill in the introduction to this sermon a series of jokes, because I know that I'm often seen as the funny rabbi. The truth is that this week has been an extremely difficult week. It seems like it's not appropriate to be joking around at this time. There is so much pain in the world. And with the advent of Shabbat and the turning off of the news, at least for a moment I could make believe that there wasn't a war going on in the world, with 200,000 Jews in arm's length, in harm's way, in a country that is wrought with a complicated history with the Jewish people. I had a difficult moment earlier this week, as is often the case in the life of a rabbi. I was called to a hospital room to say a final vidui, a final confessional with a woman who was dying. I rushed to the hospital, and there I found a woman all by herself. No one at her side. I'd been called by the Christian chaplain in the hospital over at St. John's Riverside. And there I walked into an empty room with just a dying woman there. It felt so odd. It felt so bizarre that she lay there by herself. So instead of rushing through the traditional vidui, I sat for a moment just to be with her, just to sit with her. I introduced myself, though I don't think she heard me. I said the prayers in a quiet undertone so as not to disturb her. And I recognized how important it is to simply be present, to be there in that moment. The extraordinary gift that God had given me to be able to just be there, not to do really anything, but to just be present. We live in a life right now with extremely short attention spans. Alan Bloom, I remember, wrote many years ago a book about the closing of the American mind. And I think he had no idea what was in store for how short our attention spans would become, how limited our ability to think would become. He didn't know of a world of Twitter or TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat, all platforms whose names indicate exactly what they are, just a snippet of information. You don't have to pay attention very long. Snapchat, actually, I think the conversations disappear after a few seconds, after reading them. And the difficulty of Twitter, being able to express yourself fully in 142 characters, or TikTok, as if to indicate the seconds on a clock. The difficulty of giving a sermon. 15 minutes you'll have to endure. Can you imagine that? It's considerably longer than any YouTube video you might watch. And I'm guilty as well. I'm guilty of the pleasure of watching images fly by quickly. And I'll actually end up, instead of just utilizing a few seconds, I'll spend hours watching them go by. Simone Weil, one of the great 20th century French philosophers, once wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. It's a beautiful sentence. It's a great idea, a wonderful sentiment, and one worth taking the time to think about. Being present for and with others is the greatest gift that we can give someone. And unfortunately, I add, is often wasted on the least deserving. You've heard the phrase, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. We tend to pay attention to those people who yell the loudest, who kvetch the most, who complain the most often. And those people, we give the greatest gift that we can give, and that is the gift of our presence. We listen to them. That's what I think is really going on in this week's Parsha. After the sin of the golden calf that we read about just a week ago, seemingly the Torah is teaching the Jewish people about a physical reminder of the necessity of being in the room with God. The Torah seems to indicate that the holy temple is a replacement for a golden calf, because we need something physically present in our lives in order to focus our attention. It's a lesson God learned at the Tower of Babel when the people gathered together to build a tower so high they could reach God. See, what God wanted in that moment was an understanding that being present doesn't mean being physically manifest in a building, but to be present, to be with someone. And on the backdrop of the golden calf, the Jewish people's response is overwhelming. That God asks of the Jewish people through Moses, his orator, bring whatever your heart so desires. That's the key to the sentence, right? Kol nediv libo. Everyone whose heart is so moved. God doesn't want from us empty gestures. God doesn't want empty buildings. God doesn't want silver and gold that's meaningless to us. God wants us to give of our hearts. It is so easily understood and incredibly instructive. Moses doesn't want a half-hearted effort. God wants us, through Moses, to be full. God doesn't want us to give gifts we don't mean. One more example that our society has given us. I'm so bothered when people say, "I'm sorry you feel that way." You know what that means? It means I'm not sorry. It means I'm sorry you feel that way. We're getting good at that. We hear our leaders all the time say, "I'm sorry you were offended by that," rather than saying, "I'm sorry that my words hurt." So the Jewish people ask for a restart in this week's Parsha. Vayomru el Moshe lemor marbim ha'am lahavi midai havodam lamacha asher tziva Adonai la'asot ota. That when Moses asks for gifts for the tabernacle's construction, Bezalel becomes overwhelmed by the amount of material possessions that they give forward. And Bezalel says to Moshe, these people, they're bringing more than is needed for the task entailed in the work that God has instructed us to do. We have too much stuff. Could you imagine a synagogue campaign in which the rabbi comes to somebody and says, "Could you make a donation?" And the congregation overwhelmingly responds. And then the people working on the committee say, "Rabbi, can you tell them to please stop giving?" But we can see it and we understand it on the backdrop of the golden calf story. after the greatest sin that the Jewish people had ever done, they just want to give more and more stuff, as if to make it up to Moses, as if to make it up to God, as if to in some way figure out how to fix the mistake that they made. They give more than Moses could have ever imagined. And I can only imagine what the Jewish people must have felt like in that moment when Moses says to the Jewish people, "Stop giving, you've given enough." You know the feeling of having a gift rejected. And so the cycle begins again. The Jewish people feel guilty. They give in response to that sense of being guilty. Moses says, "That's wonderful, but that's enough." And the cycle continues. The deeply felt pain of rejection. You can almost hear the people saying, "But you asked for it." See, they've all made the same mistake. And we all make that same mistake. And that is to think that we can make it up to people by giving gifts. The husband who comes home after forgetting an anniversary and brings a beautiful tennis bracelet is trying to make up for the fact that he had forgotten something. We all do it, whether it's with flowers or scarves or ties or sweaters. We try to make up for our inadequacy in remembering those significant moments. Rabbi Isaac ben Moshe Arama of Spain in the 15th century lays it out so clearly in his commentary known as the Akedat Yitzchak. He writes as follows: "In theory, any thinking Jew can build a tabernacle, even though he may lack the proper materials to carry out the actual construction." This is an allegory, he says. Daber el bnei Yisrael vaychu li truma mi'et kol ish asher yidbenu libo tichu et trumati. When the Torah says everybody should give of their heart, the Arama is teaching us in Akedat Yitzchak, it's so simple. You don't need material possessions to build a sanctuary in your heart for God to reside. You just need to, as we've heard so many times, just let God in. You don't need material possessions. You don't need great wealth. What you need is an open heart, asher yidbenu libo, a desire to fulfill God's wishes with your heart. Arama calls for two important things, he says. He says you need a nishbrei lev and anivut. In the Akedat Yitzchak, he quotes the prophet Isaiah, and he says there are only two things you need in order to build a sanctuary within you for God to reside, and that is a sense of humility that's born of brokenness. A humility born of brokenness. Each and every one of us in our lives at some point, if we haven't experienced yet, it's coming, I promise you, is going to understand that in some way we are broken. That's why we are continuously looking for ways to do a tikkun, a repair. We're all broken by experiences of the past, by sins we have committed, by wrongs we have done, by people we have hurt. All of us experiences a sense of brokenness, which should bring us to a place of anivut, a place of humility. And so we have to understand that we can and must grow in humility as we recognize our brokenness, as the Jewish people felt so broken after the golden calf. We've all done things in our life over which we have been embarrassed, in which we feel less than, in which we feel other than. And for ways we must find forgiveness of ourselves. And then once we have found that forgiveness within ourselves, we have to extend that compassion to others. We all have losses in our lives, and those losses cannot be filled by something material. For those of us who have lost loved ones, there isn't a single object that fills that hole in our lives. For those of us who have experienced a loss of trust with another person, just like the Jewish people and God and Moses felt a sense of loss of trust, of infidelity in the golden calf, there's an understanding in this week's parsha that no matter how much you give, it won't be enough until you recognize that the giving has to come from your heart, not from your pocket. While the people of the desert experience is regularly referred to as a stiff-necked people, a stubborn people, the Aramah points out that we are also a deeply kind and compassionate people, a people deeply feeling and extremely generous. For a nation that has been expelled, has been oppressed, has been murdered, we always remain hopeful and kind and generous. Just look at all the museums and hospital wings and art institutions that bear the names of Jews who are willing to share their wealth. And that has to extend to our personal lives as well. It can't just be about stuff. Our gifts have to be about more than material possessions. The greatest gifts we give can come from just being present in other people's lives, giving people the attention they deserve. So I remind you what Weil said. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. We, each and every one of us, has a deep well of kindness, of compassion, of love, and that's what we ought to share. We have the ability to put down our phones, to put down our laptops, to put away our tablets, and pay attention to the people in our lives. Being engaged with the people around us is hard. It means understanding our own emotions and understanding our own motivations. It means not ascribing to others deficiencies that we see in ourselves. It means not judging others and telling them what their motivations are. It means not reading into everything and everyone something. It means not pointing out what they do and don't do, what they do and don't say. It's hard. But the Aramah says, recognize that it comes from a place of brokenness. And if we can find humility, then we can bridge those gaps. If you pay attention to someone, if you watch them, if you listen to them, if you notice them, if you pay attention to them, then you're telling them that they're important. So I want to conclude with one story that comes from the Ukraine. After one of the worst massacres in Jewish history to that date, the Khmelnytsky massacres, in the 17th century, it was followed by something even far worse, and that was the Shoah. One of the worst concentration camps in all was that of Babi Yar, found in the Ukraine. It's said 34,000 Jews were killed in a matter of 2 days. So I conclude with this story that is told by Yafa Eliach in a great anthology known as Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust. The story is about something that happened in Janauska. It was a work camp that was near Lvov in the Ukraine. The Nazis had forced the Jews to dig these huge digs, these huge pits, and then forced them to leap across them. Those who successfully made the jump would live. Those who fell into the pit would meet their deaths. Two men stood at the edge of the pit, a rabbi of Bluvaj, Rabbi Israel Spira, and a friend who was a free thinker and an anti-religious Jew. Even though neither man was in great physical shape, they both jumped and they both made it across. The free thinker turned to the rabbi and said, "How'd you do that? How'd you make it across?" The rabbi replied, "I was holding on to my ancestral merit. I was holding on to the coattails of my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather of blessed memory." "But you, my friend," the rabbi asked, "how did you reach the other side?" And the rabbi's friend answered, "I was holding on to you." We can make it through just as long as we hold on to each other, just as long as we remain present for each other. Recognize that inside each of us is a kedusha, a holiness born of the divine. Each of us has value and worth and purpose and merit. We just have to be present for it, and then it will shine through. Shabbat Shalom. Continue with Musaf, page 184. Chatzi Kaddish, please rise.